afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on infusion of Aboriginal content and decolonizing curriculum. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional territory of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam First Nations. And we're going to jump right in, and I'd like to introduce our panel. So to my right, I would like to introduce Chaz, Desjarlais, who is a Métis Cree educator and scholar working for the Vancouver School Board as the Aboriginal Education Curriculum Consultant. She is a member of the Cold Lake First Nation and is currently enrolled in the Department of Educational Studies, pursuing a doctorate in educational leadership and policy. Beside Chaz, we have Greg Sutherland, who is a secondary teacher from the Coquitlam School District. He is currently seconded as the faculty associate for SFU, where he works with pre-service K-12 teachers in a module that focuses on social justice inside and outside the classroom. As part of this journey of reconciliation, Greg has recently been examining his own identity as a Métis educator and researcher. Beside Greg, we have Liz Krieg, a settler of German, Irish, and Scottish descent. She is the Aboriginal Education Enhancement Teacher with the Vancouver School Board. She has learned the history of BC when working for the Union of BC Indian Chiefs as an archivist assistant. This experience led to a master's thesis on how colonial ideologies of land are perpetuated in social studies curriculum. Liz then went into teaching to share what she learned with students and staff, and to encourage other white settlers to examine their connections to this colonial narrative. And beside Liz, we have Shanee, Prasad, a settler woman of color of South Asian ancestry. She's a teacher at Burn Creek Community School and also has had experience in teaching senior alternative education. She's the vice president of Peace and Global Educators, and her PSA is exploring the new curriculum and the infusion of Aboriginal worldview into the K-12 curriculum. Welcome, everyone.
Thank you.
So we have a few questions that we want to ponder this afternoon, and we're going to again dive right in. And I will begin with the first question. The Ministry of Education ministerial order requires mandatory implementation and fusion of Aboriginal content and perspectives. An important part of the curriculum transformation is the authentic and respectful inclusion of Aboriginal content, culture, and knowledge. What, in your opinion, needs to be in place to make this implementation successful?
I guess I'll start off. In my work as the Aboriginal Education Curriculum Consultant with the Vancouver School Board, I have been doing a lot of professional development with administrators and teachers across our own district, as well as being a facilitator for Aboriginal education. And have a lot of, educators very worried about taking on this work or being in a position of being frightened or scared to begin to take on the work. And I encourage them, when they begin to think about this work, is to think about the 4 R's or the 5 R's or the 6 R's, and encourage them to read Werner Kirkness and Ray Barnhart's article that was written in 1991, which will give you a really good understanding of Indigenous philosophy on education, that we need to be respectful in the work that we're doing. The work needs to be relevant in regards to your own classroom. So respect, relevancy, there needs to be reciprocity between the material that you're learning and how is it giving back to your students' understanding. Is it developing really critical understandings of Aboriginal perspectives? And the last one, I always forget them all. Respect, reciprocity, relevance, and anyway, I can't remember the other one. Another one that I also encourage is to think about the 7 sacred teachings and how they can use that as a guide or a framework of understanding to begin to do their work, in regards to having humility to understand that the work that they're going to do, it requires a lot of, it's hard work. having courage to take on the work. So the educators really need to look at themselves and see where their own understanding is in regards to Aboriginal content in history. Having respect for the process, that it is a process and it's not a product. Understanding that there's wisdom contained in Indigenous knowledges and pedagogies. Having love for education and continuing to understand that learning takes love. Honesty, being honest about the process, and being truthful to understanding what the truth is about the history. And we know that, I know as an educator myself, and I always encourage other educators to continue learning, keep learning.
If I can just add to that, and that's an excellent answer. But just that I think really the desire for when we talk about reconciliation, truth often comes before that, right? And those are both nouns. And if we begin to think about this process as in terms of verbification, and so that these are really processes. So it's a matter of truth telling. And reconciling, and that this doesn't happen overnight, and that it's a process rather than a product. I think as Chaz already said, like really hard work and time. We need to be patient. The principles of First Nations learning say that learning takes time and patience, right? And we need to understand that for ourselves. Right, that this can't happen overnight. Also, I think really, and it's sometimes counterintuitive for educators, but an awareness that education isn't benign in and of itself. Right, without a moral compass, it can be dangerous. Right, and I think the legacy of residential schools teaches us that. The Holocaust survivor, Haim Gino, teaches us, and I'm paraphrasing that, right, that he said after his experience in the Holocaust, right, I'm distrustful of education, right? I've seen right, doctors and nurses experiment on people. I've seen engineers design gas chambers. I've seen college graduates and high school students and high school graduates, put people in gas chambers, right? And so education in and of itself isn't good, right? It's only good if it's constructed around the right framework. Part of this, though, is also, I think what needs to happen, part and parcel of this is the belief in the efficacy of education at the same time. I mean, it's kind of the other side of that coin, but I think what needs to be there is to believe that education can change societies, it can change worldview. And hopefully, as educators, that's something that we believe when we go into it. So I guess to remind ourselves of that. And then, and this sort of links back to one of my first points, that just real patience with ourselves. That, we understand in all teaching processes that we don't begin as masters, right? We whenever we do something to begin with, it's not perfect, and it takes a long time. And I think one of the things that can hold educators back is the desire that if we're going to do it, it needs to be perfect. And I think we need to let ourselves off the hook a little bit on that one.
Absolutely. I'm coming at this from the perspective of a white settler. And my experiences before I went into teaching almost stopped me from going into teaching completely because I had so much fear around it. How do you have these difficult conversations in a classroom and keep all of the kids safe? And I realized that that's not completely the role of an educator, it's just to keep kids safe. It's how do you navigate those difficult conversations, and how do you allow each of your students to have voice in that. I came to this work through really a series of disruptions in my own knowledge and from what I had learned in high school. And through building relationships, I think is really also how we're going to enter into this work. To kind of build off some of your point, there's a lot of distrust in our country between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples because we've been taught to distrust each other through media, through our families. For myself, it's dealing with the embedded racism that, sideways conversations with family. So it's coming to terms with that and looking at my own relationship. And that's really, people ask, because I'm currently in this position as a white person, as an Aboriginal enhancement teacher, and when they ask me, why are you in this position and how did you get there? It's not something that I would have entered into if families and a couple of colleagues hadn't said, we think you might be good for this. So and the reason why they said that was because I had built the trust and that they knew that I knew my own history. I knew my own connections to the history of colonization, and I was able to speak very freely about that without any hindrance. And I mean, this is a 10, 12-year process that I've been a part of. And it's something that we as educators need to take a moment of pause to stop and reflect upon what that means for every single one of us.
Absolutely, I totally agree. And I think that just using that as a starting point, like to recognize that as educators, we're all coming here with a different experience. And navigating one's own experience and lived experience and how they understand themselves as a citizen of Canada, how they understand themselves as a citizen of British Columbia, of their own local, all of those things require time and they require funding, and this implementation process needs that. We need more time and space. If we're gonna implement this curriculum with an Aboriginal lens and worldview, we have to do it in a manner in which we form community. And to form community, we need to be together and we need to have that time and space. I keep thinking about what Chaz had mentioned earlier about love, and thinking about Bell Hooks, who often, she's a black feminist from the United States, talks about love and how you build that in community. Well, you build that through dedicating time to one another. And I think that right now in the implementation of this curriculum, we don't have enough time and we don't have enough space to do that with one another.
Aboriginal people are part of the historical and contemporary foundation of BC and Canada, and an introduction to Aboriginal perspectives provides BC students with an opportunity to develop empathy and, above all, respect. How do we engage teachers and students so they are receptive to Aboriginal content and perspectives?
I can start with that. And again, I think it really begins with each person beginning to unpack their own history and their own understanding about where they come in on the timeline of the colonial narrative in Canada. When I'm working with students and teachers, that's an exercise that I get them to start to do. So thinking about, who are you on, the Coast Salish territory? How long has your family been here? And I share my own family history as a model, and then get them to do that too. And then looking at timeline up until this very moment in media to see what's been happening with the relationship between Indigenous and non, and where do they begin to fit in. So that's one of the things that I do.
Yeah, I agree. It's about the timeline and where you fit in on that, and I think it's also about active listening and how are we employing that in the work that we do. I think that this is deeply connected to the issue of funding also in terms of like field trips. I work at a secondary level where we don't have enough funding to get out there into the community to explore our local Aboriginal history, and I think that would facilitate students being much more empathetic and educators ourselves being more empathetic to this content and to this understanding, because it is so dramatically different from a Western perspective, and how do we enter into that. So I think there's that portion of it too, and with active listening I think we can bridge many gaps.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree, and also just I think what engages everyone really is thinking about what's at stake. Truly, I saw Manu Meyer speak a couple of weeks ago, and she's a Hawaiian scholar, and she does a lot on Indigenous epistemologies. They came out of her doctoral work at Harvard. And she said, and she put a pretty fine point on it, and she said that, truly healing the earth is the only scholarly endeavor worthwhile at this point. And, I don't know that I disagree. And so I think that if we can communicate really what's at stake, I think that can shake people out of their apathy in some ways and get people engaged. Bob Canoe spoke at the Playhouse last month, and he was actually talking about, he had a really interesting piece about why the world needs an Indigenous perspective, and he talked about technologies. He talked about the rise of social networking technologies, Facebook, Twitter, and things like this, and how it mirrors, sort of this economy of gifting. How in some ways it mirrors a potlatch, this idea of sort of who gives the most is the wealthiest. And he, obviously, the Indigenous epistemology is essential when we think about environmentalism, right? I mean, I think a lot of the data out there is pretty bleak. I think that the capitalism, sort of as a driving force behind colonialism, really has taken us only so far, and we need to rethink that. And I think Indigenous perspectives are a way to inform maybe a shift away from that kind of dialectic. Wab also pointed out that maybe an Indigenous perspective can help us think about the increasing disparity in wealth globally. Right? I mean, we see people wealthier than they've ever been. We also see people poorer than they've ever been, right? This idea of sort of the 1%ers. And he talked about the ideology in this, and the Lakota proverb that, right, the chief should be the poorest in the village, right? He pointed out also that, in terms of LGBTQ rights, right, that Indigenous epistemology really can move our thinking forward in terms of the idea of two-spirited or this sort of this breaking down this idea of a dichotomous gender. I mean, he applied it to a number of things, but really I think the stakes are pretty grave.
I think, what we could do better as educators is providing our students with an opportunity, like Shanee said, getting our students out onto land and engaging in those relationships, not only with each other, which is very vital, building on relationships with one another, but also building on relationships with the land and having the land be our teacher. And we can't do that stuck in classrooms, and we need to have money and the resources within the schools to allow to give every student an opportunity, so that, because if you are learning about Aboriginal content and perspectives in the classroom, with 4 white walls surrounding you, you're losing the essence of really, truly what you need to do is to be out onto land and experiencing, because one of the core underpinnings of Aboriginal education is experiential learning. And so being in relationship to one another, but also being in relationship to the land, and learning about the cultural ways and the practices that we can't do that stuck in a classroom, stuck in a desk, but also honoring the spirituality of our students and sharing that with other students, I think is really important, not just focusing on the academic things. We need to be able to make connections and holistically provide those opportunities to our students.
Gail, can I
question. So I have a question here, and it's a colleague who's watching from China at a BC offshore school, and their question, and I'm sure this is a question for all teachers, we'll have this, it's a common question, and they're concerned about addressing the infusion of Aboriginal content into their teaching in an authentic way, without without connecting to community. How can they do this if there isn't an Aboriginal community nearby? And another question that came up as well is, what do you suggest people do for teachers to start to engage with Aboriginal community? How would you go about doing that? What would you suggest to a colleague who would like to participate in going to visit the community, or where would you get them to start if they're in a urban area?
I can speak to that. I get that question a lot from educators, and my recommendation to them is that those relationships with the local community take time, and you can't assume that it's always going to be an easy process when you're trying to develop relationships with the local community. But going out and supporting local events, getting to know what is being offered at your Friendship Center and other Aboriginal events that are being promoted, and introducing yourself, and it takes time, and you have to be slow and be respectful about that process, because you do need to build trust, and you can't automatically assume that if it does take time. But I always recommend that if you're wanting to develop that relationship with the local community, most nations have their own education departments, so getting into contact with somebody there and asking, what sort of supports, or if you have something particular that you'd like to focus on, asking them who would best be able to support them with that.
I can speak to the question about if there aren't community resources to tap into. I think literature is a really wonderful way to make that happen. I'm an English teacher by trade, and there's so many wonderful texts that can be brought into the classroom and used in a variety of ways that really I think very nicely push back towards a lot of the sort of two-dimensional coming into representation that we've seen in subsequent decades. CBC just put out a list of, I think, 30 that are sort of top 30 books about reconciliation. So I recommend checking those out.
And I would like to also offer, just seeing that our colleague is working in China, the global aspect of this. You have the United Nations that has many documents. They have had many tribunals that have recognized the rights of Indigenous people all over the world. And I think that's a great place to start. And to also draw the connections between Indigenous movements all over the world and how they intersect with Aboriginal movements here in North America. You have Indigenous communities fighting. They're at the forefront of climate justice. And I think you can draw many connections there, especially with what might be happening in mainland China, and how in mainland China there is quite a vibrant discussion on those issues of climate. So there are many connections to be drawn, and I think looking to social movements can often help bridge those gaps that you might think are there. Well, they are actually there, but I think you get what I mean.
Okay, we will go to our next question. The integration of Aboriginal perspectives and knowledge in the curriculum serves as an important first step to begin to address the misunderstandings of Aboriginal cultures. So, how do we critically understand and challenge underlying assumptions, values, and methods of Western education and history? And how do you facilitate this within your positions? And what can we do as BCTF, as an organization, to facilitate and advocate for what teachers need?
I can speak to the first part of that in terms of what the BCTF can do. That's complex. I mean, both parts are complex, but in my role as a faculty associate in professional programs for SFU, we were on the front line in terms of helping our student teachers or teacher candidates to build Indigenous pedagogies and epistemologies into their practice right from the get-go, right? And so one of our approaches, taking a page from Susan Dion, who works out of York University, is what she calls sort of files of uncertainty. And this is similar to what Liz was talking about, but just that the personal is a really fruitful place to start, and we can all be experts in our own autobiography. And what Dion for years has asked her students to do, and what I do with my students, is really asking students to mind their own autobiography and consider what the contact sites are between their lives and Indigenous Canada. Because what Dion posits is that one of the things that allows inaction is to be able to claim a position of perfect stranger, she uses the term, right? And so, if we can say, well, that doesn't resonate in my lived experience, right? That I can't speak to that, and it's and it's not true. Like we all have a relationship living in Canada. John Ralston Saul, has suggested even that Canada itself is a Métis nation, right? And so to get, what I ask my students to do is really just to come up with 3 or 4 artifacts from their personal autobiography and revisit them. Now that they know a little bit more. And think about really critically how those colonial narratives have shaped their existing worldview.
I'll just add to that because I use Susan Dion a lot in the work that I do in terms of professional development. And one article that has been really useful is Disrupting Molded Images, where she really outlines that process that she goes through with her teachers, and it's a really nice way to enter into the dialogue. Stuff that I do, and again, it's drawing people and connecting people to what actually created this country. And I think this is where we see the most amount of resistance, because Canadians like to see ourselves as a nation of nice people. And somehow this idea that if we actually acknowledge our collective history and what's happening currently, that somehow we're not nice. And I think we need to move beyond that to have these critical conversations, because as what was pointed out, we have to look at what's at stake. So whether this is the nurses who don't respond to an Indigenous man in distress, whether this is a young man who is shot for trying to get help for a car, whether this is young people who are being put into care, there's so many things at stake. And we are at a time where we're looking at this idea of truth and reconciliation. And again, in order to get to the reconciliation point, as you pointed out, we have to look at the truth. And the TRC was amazing because there were so many people who were willing to share their stories. What I would have liked to have seen was more settlers coming to the table to actually listen. And I think that's, if anything, if you're beginning to start your process in this journey, is just see yourself as someone coming to the table to listen. And I think if you're starting from that place, in a place of humility, then your journey has already begun.
That's very true. I think in terms of what the BCTF can do, I think the BCTF has begun engaging in issues around equity and inclusion, and I think we need to advocate strongly for that as we go forth as a union movement for our collective membership, and really start to develop an anti-oppression lens, and how that facilitates the implementation of this curriculum is that it will help all of us get to a place in which we can start to ask those wider questions of our own privilege if we are non-Aboriginal and we're allies. You know, becoming an ally is a process. It doesn't happen overnight, and it really requires that we're dedicated to that process. So the more our union becomes dedicated to that, the more we will as members. And also starting from a position in which we're telling our members that you have the strengths and gifts for this. You have that. We as teachers have that. We go into our classrooms every day. We're working under very heavy workloads. We're working with huge underfunding in our system, but we're getting through it every day, and we're building relationships with our kids. So this is something we're absolutely capable of doing, and we need to look to one another for it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I have some questions for you. The lines are heating up here. There's a couple, and I'll read them to you. One is, could you, in your responses, give some concrete examples of how you have used Aboriginal literature or Aboriginal ways of teaching in your classroom, in the subject areas you teach? There are some concrete examples you can share. I responded by saying we have Teach BC as well, and Project of Heart, which is on the BCTF website. But another question that came up, which I thought was connected to some degree, but from a different colleague, and it's, what are the ways in which Aboriginal teachers can protect themselves from unfriendly learning environments? And someone else gave the response of, we have a BCTF, we have a code of ethics around that you need to also be using. And so I think this is the part where potentially things could, you might have some experience in this in working with colleagues and working to infuse this order from government to have this be infused in the curriculum. And as you've said at different times, with no money attached. So, Chaz, and just speak into the mics, guys, because sometimes people are
I think, we need to really start, I know I have been an educator for a very long time, and we get stuck in our classrooms, and we need to create community in our schools and really build relationships amongst educators. I know, we do that at lunch, we do that at breaks, but really create like mentorship relationships where we can speak to one another and help guide one another in doing this work. And whether it be an ally or an Indigenous educator, I think creating more of those kind of relationships in school and sharing what sort of strengths we've seen, like in regards to our lesson plans or anything to do with Aboriginal pedagogy that we have had successes with, and then sharing that out with the school community, with other teachers. Because sometimes I think we forget, we get into our classrooms and we forget about, sharing those successes. And I think that is just a little step I think can go a long ways, is about really being open about developing those relationships, and because this work can't be done alone. It is a collective effort of all educators to share with each other the best practices that they've been doing in their own school. And maybe, everybody has different access points in being able to do this work, but putting your work, like Chris said, on Teach BC, sharing out within your school and creating those learning commons, or, and building relationships, I think is crucial in order for this work to be really sustainable. And having it be a process that is shows reciprocity, I think, is crucial.
It's hard for me to think about giving a concrete example without going into like a full set of lesson plans. But I was just thinking about the last Pro D, I went to the Museum of Anthropology, and the Musqueam Toolkit is now available, I think, across the province, not just in Vancouver. But in the toolkit, it was written and created by people in the community, in the Musqueam community. And it has things for elementary school, has things for high school. So I mean, that's just one example of different organizations that have been creating resources for teachers. So, and like just to add to what Chaz was saying, sometimes we think that the things aren't out there, but it's maybe just a matter of speaking with some other colleagues or speaking with the Aboriginal enhancement teams within your district as a good way and a good place to start.
An example that I'd like to offer is that during the federal election, our school engaged in student vote. And one of the things we had the students do were create questions, because we invited in the MPs that were up for election, and they could ask them questions. And we really discussed and came up with terms of what these questions were going to be. And we encouraged the kids to get the perspective from the local Aboriginal organizations. And they went out and they, really explored what those issues were and came back with a dynamic list of questions. And it really helped them understand that Aboriginal, epistemologies and worldview, it's not just about history. It is so much about what's happening today, here and now, and in our local communities. Thinking about what it means to defend land, it really helped them understand what that meant. So I thought that was a great way to kind of start looking at how we, look at current events and things like that.
Sorry, can I just add something?
Yeah.
Sorry. Thinking about too the First Peoples Principles of Learning is also an amazing place to start, and having that poster in your classroom, so when you're doing something, you can refer to it to say, and this is also part of Indigenous knowledges, and being able to have that discussion with your students. So some of the practices may be something you're already doing in your classroom. It's the epistemology, not necessarily the content. So you can direct yourself as well as your students to begin to understand that the way that you're teaching actually comes from a worldview as well, and that you're acknowledging that at this point we actually see the worldviews come together. So that's something else that you can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just to add to that, and as a starting point, just honesty and humility, right? To be really transparent in our own progress, right? We talked about before how it's not about getting to a fixed point. It's about work, and so to be transparent with your students, around the work that we're doing. In terms of specific texts and what I've done with them in the past, I'm a secondary English teacher, so I've used in kind of lit circle models or independent novel studies. We've done Sherman Alexi's Absolute True Diary, and kids like that. We've done Eden Robinson's Monkey Beach. We've done Thomas King's Truth About Stories, or King's Inconvenient Indian. Like there are a lot of texts out there that kids really like, and if anyone wants to email me, I can send them my novel study project.
You can upload it on TeachBC.
Oh, perfect. Even easier. And then as a teacher educator, student teachers always have a really tough time knowing where to start, and so I always suggest start really small, because this is a huge process. Particularly teachers who are teaching outside, who are in those subject areas that I think traditionally they felt that it sort of isn't their business. So they're teaching chemistry 12, and how do I make a connection? And of course, we know that there's lots of fruitful contact sites there. But even something as small as land acknowledgement is a first step. Really, I've had some amazing conversations with students when I started doing that a few years ago in my classroom. Really, I guess being humble and saying look, this is the step I know how to make.
I have another question. Can I?
Can we answer the one on how can Aboriginal
sure.
teachers
Okay, yeah, do
protect
that.
themselves?
Okay.
Because I think that's very important in this process. And sorry, I just jumped in there, but I do think that as looking at our profession, we're all colleagues, we're all in solidarity with one another, and I think it's super important that we're not downloading the implementation of this curriculum onto our Aboriginal colleagues. I think there might be pressure for our Aboriginal colleagues to be the ones that give the resources, that explain terminology. Aboriginal identity, like any identity, is not homogenous. We have to start at that point, and navigating your identity, especially as an Aboriginal person, is very complex. It's very layered, and I think that we have to reach out to our Aboriginal colleagues, let them know that they're not alone, ask them for advice, and be very sensitive to how they would like to participate, perhaps thinking about suspending some of the organizational models we use, like Robert's Rules and things like that, and thinking about consensus and thinking about how we are dialoguing with our colleagues. And that is also something that I think we think about in our classrooms. So I do think that how our Aboriginal colleagues might be feeling through this process is something that we're not considering. And I would like that to be a consideration that we bring to the forefront. It's very hard for non-Aboriginal people to understand what this curriculum implementation looks like from an Aboriginal point of view, right? And that is the focus of history, of people's identity, all at once happening while one is navigating that. So I think being sensitive to how we do this is huge, and that we are there and that we're remembering our collective commitment to solidarity.
You know what, I just want to add something to, and it's part of this question. It's still part of this. There's somebody who's asking on here around, and you can get back to it, Chaz. A colleague is saying that they're feeling alone, and it's still part of how do you support Aboriginal teachers through this. And how do you, and the aloneness is partly connected to not having the support, they're feeling not having the support of government to help implement this over a longer period of time. And there's another colleague on here who's asking about, and it's still connected to the aloneness, but it's about how do you implement this and be a strong ally working with Aboriginal teachers, First Nations Aboriginal teachers, and getting, this particular colleague is saying they're not feeling that their immediate circle of colleagues or friends actually understand what they're doing, and as they become or as they are allies to support Aboriginal teachers. So those were two things. It was around the aloneness, not having the support of, feeling not supported by government to really do a good job in this area, and then an ally wanting to work with Aboriginal teachers but also not sure of themselves around how to do that. And there you go.
Well, I think for myself as an Aboriginal educator, I can, I feel the sentiment of some Aboriginal educators or enhancement workers where, you know, we have been burdened with the responsibility, or the expert has been placed upon ourselves. And what allies need to understand is that they need to do their homework as well. That, you know, we are still learning. And like Shanee said, we're not a homogenized people. The First Peoples Principles of Learning is a universal understanding, and that, you know, me coming to it as a Krieg Métis woman, my understanding would be a little bit different, but I can appreciate how those are kind of unifying understandings. So I think, you know, allies definitely doing their homework and sharing the workload, because I know as an Aboriginal educator in the consultant position, there's just one of me in the district, but I have a very strong team that works with me, and that schools, you know, their Aboriginal education departments, depending on the district, can be very small or they can be quite large, but, you know, there's lots of resources in regards to people. You know, we have a lot of different understandings, but I think it needs to be a shared work shared work, because it is quite a burden to take it on, and to have people come to you all the time. And of course, I want to be helpful. And the same thing with our classrooms. We can't expect our students to be the experts in regards to Indigenous knowledges or Aboriginal epistemologies. There's a very good book that educators can read. Sheila Cote Meek has written a book called Colonized Classrooms, and it's a post-secondary context, but I think it's very helpful for educators to read, and they can think about that in regards to the K-12 system, about things, how they should go about doing their work, but in developing relationships with their Aboriginal students in regards to sharing Aboriginal content and perspectives in the classroom.
I'd like to just jump in there and say that, like, I agree with Chaz. And in terms of what we can do at the local level, I think that we do need to be, we need to pay careful attention to the workload issues our Aboriginal colleagues are facing, and make sure that that comes up in our local discussions. And also, we can all take a look, and it's always healthy to revisit language that exists in the local, anti-racist language, anti-sexist language, and be revisiting that, and perhaps, you know, bringing forward changes that might need to happen in terms of that. We are a social justice union, so this is a social justice issue, and many of our colleagues are having to face very uncomfortable conversations. Many of our Aboriginal colleagues are having to face uncomfortable conversations with this implementation. So thinking about guidelines and protocols and processes and helping our membership collectively remember what these are is a really great step. And it's good for the health of any union or organization. So let's put that forward.
Okay, you've got one more there.
No.
Okay, I have another one here. And it's how, okay, I'm going to read this to you. It is, what advice would you give a new teacher who is at the beginning of their own truth and reconciliation journey, who may receive pushback from families or their students with negative pressures and reactions to becoming an authentic ally? So,
I think we can only speak our own truth. And when you're speaking your truth from the heart, people tend to begin to listen. It doesn't matter if you're a beginning teacher or if you've been in the field for 20 or 30 years, this is something that is going to continue on, because we're dealing with hundreds of years of imperial and colonialism that's been embedded in our minds. So I wish I could say there's a magic template or something we could give you, but I think it's beginning to navigate, again, who you are in this journey, having the humility to speak about it, but also the strength. Again, as a white settler, my voice in the room is often the most privileged. And so if I'm the one who's remaining silent, then I am not being an ally. I am not doing the things, and I have to go home at night and look at myself in the mirror and say, did I do enough today to support my colleagues and my students? So there is going to be resistance, there is going to be backlash anytime there is a social justice movement that happens. So it's just finding the strength to really stay with it, and to do your homework, like Chaz said, so that you have the answers to the stereotypes and the racism. Again, these are things that have been embedded in our education system for a long time. So I try to remember that people, and I don't always do it well, because emotions come up. And I have had to remove myself from some conversations because I know I'm not going to say something professional. So in that moment, having the wherewithal to take a step back, but also come back to it. So maybe say, you know what, I'm having a hard time with this conversation. I need to think a little bit. I'd like to get back to you. So those are some of the things that I would suggest.
Yeah. you know, I mean, that was a lovely answer, and I think, you know, again, that it's all change is hard, right? You know, most of the conversations that I have with teacher educators around this, or new teachers, or school associates who are working in partnership with our program, and often when we talk about it with colleagues in the Faculty of Education, like, these conversations end in tears, right? Like they're and not tears because it's hard work, right? You know, and I think you know, the tears come from a place of respect, but it's a lot of work to acknowledge that some of the narratives that we cling to as Canadians are fictions, and it runs really contrary to how we construct our own identities, right? And so it's you know, walk slowly. I guess the other thing I would say to a new teacher, or to any teacher who feels you know, maybe they're getting pushback, is you know, you don't necessarily have to convince anyone. Just do your own thing, and sometimes you can lead side by side, right? It's really interesting. You know, a number of years ago now, right? The BCTF put out those rainbow stickers, right? Right, that said this is a safe place for LGBTQ students or people. And as I put one on my door, I realized that in doing that, what I actually did was I politicized everyone's door, right? Because it made conservative politics opaque at that point, right? Because neutrality is a deeply political stance too.
Do you have any more questions?
Oh, okay. I do have another one here. Okay. The another question that's come up is the using of Aboriginal spiritual teachings, working with elders in your community. I wonder if you wanted to say anything about that. If you don't feel comfortable saying anything, that's fine. But if you have experience in that area, please do.
Well, I think that teachers kind of feel discomfort in thinking about the spirituality part of Aboriginal. I think they get really discomforted, but it's really integral to our understanding as Aboriginal people or Indigenous people, the spirituality aspect. And I think it's really important to invite elders in to do that work, because our schools are still colonial sites where our students are still being colonized, and opening up and bringing those opportunities in, I think, will begin to disrupt, you know, settler educators' understandings. And, you know, it's not perfect, and it's, you know, maybe it's not meant to have settler educators feel comfortable about that, but I think it's, I know it's something that's important, because if we're going to look at the students' well-being in a holistic sense, you need to have spirituality be a part of that, and education. And so providing those opportunities, I think, is crucial. Because I think when you think about education for Aboriginal people, I'll speak for myself, we've lost a lot going through education, the education system, and we still continue to lose a lot. So if there are educators that are settler educators that are still on the fence about whether, you know, they should take on this work, think about what has been lost. That, you know, there are many Aboriginal educators who weren't privileged to learn their traditional languages, weren't privileged to learn their culture, and that for many of us, and I speak for myself, but I know I've spoken with many other urban Aboriginals, that we've lost a lot in the process. And so this is a way that, you know, we're all learning. and educators have a moral and ethical responsibility to take on this work. It's hard work, and we're still learning, so the path is there for people to walk.
Yeah, I agree, and I think that it's so important to develop our school communities in a way in which we can have Aboriginal elders and other members from Aboriginal colleagues for our Aboriginal students. You know, it can't, right now the process is so bureaucratic in terms of how we are engaging guest speakers in our classroom. I do not conceptualize an Aboriginal elder as a guest speaker. And I don't want my students to conceptualize them as either, as guest speakers. So that's where the funding model needs to shift. That's where our processes need to shift, because this is about a cultural shift. And I think that we have to put that at the forefront. And I think as teachers, we can work together collectively to help arrange for a different process, you know, bring into light the fact that though spirituality for some of us may be an uncomfortable issue, when it comes to our students exploring their identity, it's not a non-issue. So it's a non-issue when our Aboriginal kids want to explore their spirituality.
And I think just to be mindful too, because I think that's often the conversation is when bringing elders into the classroom. I've had colleagues say, we had this person come in, but it wasn't quite what I had anticipated. And it's just to remember that whoever is coming into your room is going to share with yourself and the class what they're prepared and ready and willing to share. So having an expectation about what the person is going to say or do, really think about kind of checking that at the door when you have this person come in, because they're not going to share sacred teachings necessarily with the people in your room, because those are sacred teachings. So just when you're opening your door, open your mind and your heart too, that you're going to be having an experience that someone is willing to share with you.
One more question before we do final closing, and it is, what advice, support is important for Aboriginal heritage teachers who are triggered or re-traumatized when approaching teaching certain Aboriginal content, for example, residential school system?
I mean, this is something, again, as a white settler, I can't really speak to, because it will never be my trigger. For the students that we work with, and I have this with the teachers when they're engaging, other settler teachers are engaging with this material, reminding them and asking them to be mindful of where their Indigenous students are at with the material, because the students do get triggered as well. And so anytime, I know you use Deborah Britzman's work around the idea of difficult knowledge. So anytime, and again, my apologies, I'm speaking about it in terms of students. Anytime we're going to be working with these kinds of materials, we have a conversation as a classroom first about the idea of difficult knowledge, and asking the students what they think that means. And usually they think it's, well, we can't understand it, but it's, you know, getting them to think about, you know, it's hard on the heart, on the head, and the body. And what are some strategies and tools that you have that if you are not feeling okay, that you can begin to follow up on that. And so we have a conversation with that, and also allowing students, you know, if they need to leave the room, to have a moment to be able to touch base with those networks, that they have that opportunity.
I think, I think a lot of those conversations, it depends on how we approach them. And I think rather than looking at and focusing on the trauma, we can focus on the resilience, and we can talk about really how powerful a lot of these communities are, in spite of hundreds of years of colonial machinations, and not subscribe to a deficit model, but look at celebrate the resistance.
I think, you know, as an Aboriginal educator, I do a lot of the work of presenting, you know, the BC Blanket and the Project Heart, and I'm always reminding, you know, either educators or students that this is a lived history and that colonialism is still alive in this country, and that we've all been, you know, as Marie Batiste has said, marinated in Eurocentric thought. And so we need to understand, like if I'm to go in, that when I do this work, it's hard work. It's hard because I'm connected to the history, and to remind students to be mindful of that. And there may be Aboriginal students in the classroom too, and I'm not sure how they're going to be impacted. But the teacher being prepared well in advance to prepare the students about what they'll be learning. And you know, this is history that everybody needs to know if it's residential schools, but also focusing on, like you said, the resurgency of our nations and the resiliency of our people, and how we are thriving in contemporary times, and that we have lots of role models doing really good work, but also that it is, it's hard work. And if it's hard work for myself, then teachers need to know that, and I do tell them that this is hard work, but I'm passionate about my work, and I'm advocating because I have to think about, you know, my children who are in the education system, because I want better for them that I didn't get, but also the next 7 generations of kids yet to come that deserve better. And so this is why I take on the work that I do, why I'm passionate about the work, but also I try to share that with other educators as well.
Great. Okay, so I'm gonna, I just wanna let you know that the responses on here have been amazing, and people wanna keep this going. And we may have this again, you know, fairly soon. What I wanna do now, or maybe Gail's already got a closing activity or feedback you wanna give on this, but I thought perhaps before we close with you, the panelists might want to just say some parting words to the people out there. There's over 130 people registered. People can get online, and they will get to see this, even though they might not have been on here right now, but they can later. So please, if you could share some parting advice, words of wisdom, and then we'll have Gail close fully.
Okay, I'll start. It was great to be on this panel. Very honored to be with all of you. Parting words. Well, I don't think they're parting words because I hope we meet again. And I do want to say that that as a settler, as a non-Aboriginal, but most importantly as an ally, I look to what all of us can bring to this as teachers, as our school's staff support community, and we're all working in this together, that this is not about you going off and lesson planning at night alone. Like, I don't want this process for any of us to be that. There will be elements of that, obviously, but that the real work that we do, the groundbreaking work we do together is in collective solidarity, because that's where our power is at, and that is what the strength and gifts that we bring together as teachers. So just to remember that.
Yeah, just to thank obviously everyone who's participating today. Yeah, this is a conversation that will be ongoing for a while. For those of you who are just really beginning your journey with this work, I highly recommend that you do watch the CBC documentary Eighth Fire. It has different series. You can download it just off their website, and it's a good place to start.
Yeah, just to echo everyone's comments again, I feel very honored, and particularly because this is pretty recent work that I've started for me. I haven't been on this journey my whole life. In fact, as someone of Indigenous ancestry, it was something that was actively discouraged in my family, and it was easy as I present from a position of privilege. It was also easy for me not to do that work. And the more time I spend thinking about it, the deeper, and we talk about heart work, right? The more that's laid out for me, right? I think if and there are lots of opportunities in various communities. SFU it's going on for another few weeks, but every Thursday from 3:30 to 4:30, they have the President's Dream Colloquium, where they have a number of speakers talking about reconciliation. I can't recall who's speaking this Thursday, but if you're in the Lower Mainland, check it out. It's a free event, so that might get you started. And I guess it just is a final piece that I've said again is that to not engage in this, to not do anything, is also a political stance, and it's a political stance that reifies colonial narratives. And so by holding back, we're reinforcing the thing that we don't want to be. Thank you.
I would encourage educators to have courage, to have humility, and to honor the process, and to continue learning, because that's the only way that this will be sustainable. And as Aboriginal educators in the system, we are very marginalized. So if this work is going to be sustained, it needs to be taken up in earnest and with really truthfulness by our allies. We need to work together, and our history is a collective history as to will this educational journey moving forward.
Thank you so much. Just in closing, I would just like to share a few of the words that stood out for me, and so those were hard work, humility, truth-telling, patience with others, but also patience with ourselves. This is going to be a long journey. Shifting our worldview, building relationships, listening, taking the time to listen, navigating, but also not avoiding difficult conversations, and working together. And what was my last one? That you all have the gift. So thank you so much, Shanee, Liz, Greg, and Chaz for being with us here today. And thanks to all of you.